influence all but gone. Once he had been regarded as Rome's most implacable foe and hailed as a great hero from Greece to Syria. But now he was little more than a vagrant. The world had moved on, and Rome had moved in. Mithridates committed suicide in 62 BC in relative anonymity. Pompey re-established Roman control of Pontus before moving on to Armenia, where Tigranes welcomed him with open arms and a bended knee. The best hope of the rulers of independent kingdoms when Rome came knocking was to be left in power as a client state. Tigranes hoped that if he could ingratiate himself with Pompey, Armenia would not be turned into a full province. His efforts were successful, and Armenia was never fully incorporated into the empire. Rather, it was left as a buffer zone between Rome and the Parthians. Leaving Armenia behind, Pompey continued to march east, chasing after Mithridates, and establishing contact with the locals of the Trans-Caucasus. Eventually, he found himself at the banks of the Caspian Sea, as far from home as any Roman army had traveled. But the land was rough, and the locals not particularly rich, so Pompey turned around and decided rather to turn south, hugging the east coast of the Mediterranean, which was the true center of the Roman world anyway. He led his army into Syria, where the descendants of Antiochus fought over the throne of what remained of the Seleucid Empire. Pompey solved the issue by deposing the sitting king and establishing Syria as an official Roman province. He then continued south, intent on establishing Roman hegemony over a stretch of 10 Hellenized cities in Galilee and Judea, known as the Decapolis. He then moved inland and entered the wealthy city of Jerusalem. At the time, the city was in turmoil and in the throes of a civil and religious war between two Jewish brothers. Not only was Pompey worried that coastal stability would be threatened by inland instability, but he saw an opportunity to exploit that factionalism in the city. Both sides sought the Roman army's support, and eventually Pompey did pick a side, clearing out the rival faction and putting his favored leader on the throne. By 62 BC, Pompey decided that it was time to return home. By extending the Roman hegemony all the way to Judea, Pompey completed the Roman version of Manifest Destiny, and the empire now reached across the whole of the Mediterranean, from Gibraltar all the way to Jerusalem. He wound his way back home at the head of 45,000 men, and when he entered Rome, he celebrated the most splendid triumph of his career. No waiting in line, no sarcastic remarks. As I mentioned earlier, the kingdoms conquered, annexed, or allied with during Pompey's campaign in the east literally doubled the amount of money coming into the Roman treasury. A staggering accomplishment when you think about it. Pompey himself was rich beyond his own dreams, and at the head of 45,000 men, and easily the most popular man in Rome. The conservative Senate watched all this with understandable apprehension, but Pompey seemed content to simply bask in the glow of his own fame. In a few short years, though, those same senators who were forever trying to sabotage the young general's meteoric rise would be begging him to save the Republic. Sure, he had completely circumvented the cursus honorum and barely held an elective office and was hardly old enough to qualify for the rank and status he constantly demanded. But he did not dream of being Sulla and taking over the empire, which made him as staunch a defender of the Republic as any existed in those days. Next week, really this time, we will cover a scheming bumbler named Catiline, who would never be confused with a defender of the Republic, or a great general, or, frankly, even a particularly adequate schemer. That a man like him could dream big, violent, egotistical dreams was a sign of the times. Rome was on the brink of disaster. The Republic was on the brink of death. Catiline was just the beginning. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 38, The Catiline Conspiracy. There were dozens of contributing factors to the breakdown of the old Republican order in the 1st century BC, some economic, some administrative, some martial. But what was really at issue was a sickness that had taken hold at the very root of the political system. Until now, the quasi-religious sovereignty of the electoral process and the officials it produced was unquestioned. If you ran for consul and lost, that was it. You had lost. Maybe your political career was dead, and maybe you would run again someday. But you abided by the decision. When the Senate handed down decrees or the tribunes passed laws, maybe you didn't like it, and maybe you did everything in your power to get them repealed, but there was a way things were done. Maybe it entered into your head to do something about those so-and-sos down in the forum, and maybe after too much to drink, the conversation turned to topics like assassination and military coups, the latter no doubt a favorite topic amongst landless veterans for the whole of Roman history. But in the morning, everyone sobered up. The inertia of the system was simply too great to overcome. While there is ample evidence of political assassination directed at threats to the old order, the Gracchi being the most famous example, there is scant record of extra-legal killing directed at the old order. But by the 1st century BC, whatever spell that held ambitious men in check when they didn't get their way had been broken. Society, the kickbacks enjoyed by provincial governors, the bribery that secured lucrative posts and favorable court rulings, the cash for votes schemes that more and more determined the outcome of elections, had finally reached the heart of the system. An entire generation of men had grown up in the shadow of Marius and Sulla. No amount of democratic whitewashing could hide the truth. Power sprang from the sword. And for those bold enough and strong enough to seize what they could not legitimately earn, it was understood that power had a way of retroactively legitimizing even the most illegitimate of actions. The only rule was power by any means necessary. Because once in power, the rules could be changed, and those who disagreed could be eliminated. Oz the Great and Terrible had been seen through, and the man behind the curtain exposed. Cicero, the most persuasive speaker of his day, and perhaps in all of Roman history, spent his entire career imploring his countrymen to pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But words are no match for action, and those of us with the swords, as Pompey so aptly described his brethren, were busy plotting how to kill the man behind the curtain, become the man behind the curtain, and become Rome itself. Rome, the Great and Terrible. Lucius Sergius Catilina, known to history as Catiline, attempted in 63 BC to kill the man behind the curtain. His half-baked scheme never got off the ground, but his story touches on nearly every major player in the subsequent years of civil war in Rome. And while his plot was foiled, the sheer volume of willing accomplices shocked polite company, and reminded those with similar ambition that one of these days the Republic was going to snap in two, and the important thing was not to save it, but to make sure that you came out on top when the bow finally broke. Catiline was born in 108 BC to an ancient patrician family. While he came from a line of consuls and thus would never be considered a new man, the last of those consuls had served in the 380s BC. So Catiline carried with him all the arrogance of a well-pedigreed aristocrat, while simultaneously bearing the insecurity of knowing his family had been trading on a name that no one in recent memory had done much to earn. This would turn out to be a dangerous combination. Catiline was intent on returning his family to glory. He was bright, energetic, and charismatic, a natural leader, brave in the field, and savvy in the forum. There was no good reason why he should not be able to lead his family out of the political wilderness, and indeed his career began promisingly enough. If only he had been a good man. He entered public life by way of the social wars, serving with distinction under the command of Pompey Strabo, and alongside young Pompey Magnus and the man who would become his arch-rival, Marcus Tullius Cicero. During the years of conflict between Marius and Sulla, Catiline did his best to keep his head down. He was neither important enough to be courted, nor important enough to be disposed of. Semi-obscurity can be your best friend in times of civil strife. But once Sulla returned from the east, Catiline was one of those officially neutral aristocrats who knew which way the winds were blowing, and he publicly backed the incoming dictator. He served in a variety of administrative posts overseas after Sulla's retirement, and the young man seemed well positioned for an honorable career. But as is often the case, the true character of a man will eventually come out, and how he deals with adversity is often the best time to gauge what that true character is. In 73 BC, Catiline was accused of adultery, and not just run-of-the-mill adultery, but adultery committed with a Vestal virgin, a very serious offense. But at the trial, one of the leading men of the day and leader of the aristocratic party testified on behalf of Catiline. Character witnessing was a far more potent legal force in Rome than it is today, and with the word of Quintus Catullus backing him, Catiline was acquitted. Now, why one of the most important men in Rome would put his own name on the line for a minor noble was a curiosity. The Roman chattering classes assumed bribery played a role. So in his first real test, Catiline seems to have chosen to circumvent the rules and subvert Rome's judicial system rather than directly face whatever consequences he was in store for. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his career. But with the bullet successfully dodged, Catiline went on to serve as praetor in 68 BC, and then pro-praetor in Africa the next 2 years. In 66 BC, he entered his name as a candidate for the consulship, but the censors denied his eligibility. A minor legal technicality barred his entrance into the race, namely that the citizens of Africa were accusing him of abuse of power, of using public resources for private gain, and taking kickbacks. Furiously denying the charges, Catiline was enraged that his name was being dragged through the mud, but there was nothing he could do. He would have to wait until the matter was cleared up to run for consul again. In 65 BC, he stood trial for abuse of power and was once again acquitted when a number of leading men vouched for his character. Shiny, precious character. The skeleton of Catiline's career to this point is a matter of public record, but a few of the more unsavory details are filled in by Cicero in his famous denunciation, and later by the historian Sallust, who painted the entire Catilinian affair as a morality tale, with Catiline starring as the despicable enemy of the public good. So it is sometimes hard to tell how many of his actions were real and how many were embellished or made up out of whole cloth. For example, there is a story of an initial conspiracy that has Catiline planning the murder of half the Senate. And even men at the time believed this episode resided only in Cicero's politically motivated imagination. Certainly Catiline was not connected to any such plot by the time he was allowed to run for the consulship the following year, in 64 BC. As much as Cicero seems to have genuinely hated Catiline, he really ought to have cut him some slack. If it hadn't been for Catiline, it is likely that Cicero never would have won election and earned the consulship that he had been striving for his whole life. With Catiline running on a platform of debt cancellation and promising the sun, moon, and stars to any poor sod who would listen, the nobility had no choice but to throw their support behind the provincial novus homo who had an unhealthy obsession with philosophy, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Sure, he was a pleb who was not even a true Roman, but he was the most conservative of the available candidates, and at least argued for the continued dominance of the Senate in political affairs. Cicero had been born in Harpium, 60 miles south of Rome, and its population had been granted full citizenship not long after the end of the Second Punic War. But Cicero was never allowed to forget that he was a mere provincial. And not just a provincial, but a pleb provincial. He could trace to no ancestors, and would have to rely on his own drive to battle his way up the Roman political ladder. Luckily, he was one of the most gifted men of his generation. From the start, he was recognized as a brilliant student, and his family made sure that he received the finest education they could afford. Like most of the nobility, he was fluent in both Greek and Latin, and devoured Hellenistic philosophy. More than any other man, Cicero was responsible for the full integration of Greek thought into Roman life, translating mountains of Greek literature into Latin and promoting its study endlessly.